I stumbled across this article a few days ago on Buzzfeed News titled, How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation. Now, I get that millennials are very easy to hate, and sometimes I think it's totally legitimate, and sometimes I think it's kind of unfair criticism. But after reading this article, I can't help but feel that most of the content within this is kind of fueling the fire as to why millennials get so much criticism. So I thought there'd be no better person to criticize this article and walk through some of the contradictions within this than a fellow millennial like me. The article starts off with a little story from this guy, Tim. I tried to register for the 2016 election, but it was beyond the deadline by the time I tried to do it. I hate mailing stuff. It gives me anxiety. The amount of work logically isn't that much. Fill out a form, mail it, go to the specific place on a specific day, but those kinds of tasks can be hard for me to do if I'm not enthusiastic about it. And then later on in the article, the author says millennials love to complain about other millennials giving them a bad name. But as I fumed about this 27-year-old's post office anxiety, I was deep in a cycle of a tendency developed over the last 5 years that I've come to call errand paralysis. I'd put something on my weekly to-do list and it'd roll over one week to the next, haunting me for months. Now, somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is very prominent online, has kind of been mocked and almost ridiculed for some of the advice that he's giving largely to what people have attributed to young men. Advice like cleaning your room.
It's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. Because if you can't even clean up your own room, who the hell are you to give advice to the world?
But if you look at the core truth and what cleaning your room does, it gets your life in order and it builds momentum. It's something small that you do. It makes the environment around you better and it gets you on a momentum. It builds momentum towards progress. It actually gets you in the flow of doing things to try and better your life. And I feel like somebody who's writing an article like this, or somebody like Tim who's having trouble just going to the post office, would benefit from some of this advice because I think that type of advice is targeted specifically to him. He can't even get to the post office. He can't mail in a letter that's going to allow him to vote to hopefully better the same government that he probably spends a lot of his time on social media bitching about. Now, I say that Jordan Peterson's advice about cleaning your room might be beneficial to some people in this article, but surprisingly enough, it seems to be what they think is the cause of their burnout. They say the media that surrounds us, both social and mainstream, from Marie Kondo's new Netflix show to the lifestyle influencer economy, tells us that our personal spaces should be optimized just as much as oneself and career. The end result isn't just fatigue, but enveloping burnout that follows us to home and back. Now, maybe it's just me, but when I clean my room, when I clean my house, I feel way better. Like, yeah, in the act of cleaning my shower, in the act of cleaning my toilet, sure, there's a lot of other things I'd rather be doing. But once I'm done with it, and once I've finished and I walk around to this now clean, beautiful apartment, I feel great. It actually makes me feel wonderful. I feel like I've done something good and I'm actually proud to be in my apartment. This idea that organizing your home space and optimizing it just as you would your career is somehow contributing to burnout reminds me of Ed Lattimore's tweet about working out, which sums it up perfectly. He says, you don't have enough energy to work out because you don't work out. And to me, that's no different than people saying, oh, cleaning up my house is contributing to my burnout. It's probably because you're not really doing it that often. Because if you did, then that would just become a part of your routine and it would take less work and less effort to actually get that done. It reminds me of when, people say, oh, I have mental health issues, I have anxiety, I have depression, and people suggest, well, you should go outside, you should go for a walk, get out in the sun, and they say, I don't have the energy to do it, I can't get outside, I'm too depressed to go outside and walk. And they're like, yeah, because you're not getting outside and walking. So it's just this infinite loop of I don't have enough energy because I don't go outside, and I don't go outside because I don't have enough energy, Whereas once you had a outside source like Pokemon Go to get people outside, they realized, oh wow, being outside and going for a walk in nature actually works. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are some unfair criticisms about millennials, and some of that is due to just some economic stuff that happened in our past that we're kind of feeling the effects of that, we didn't really have much control over. And they address some of this within the article. They say, our parents, a mix of young boomers and old Gen Xers, reared us during an age of relative economic and political stability. As with previous generations, there was an expectation that the next one would be better off, both in terms of health and finances, than the one that had come before. But as millennials enter into mid-adulthood, that prognosis has been proven false. Financially speaking, most of us lag far behind where our parents were when they were our age. We have far less saved, far less equity, far less stability, and far, far more student debt. The greatest generation had the Depression and the GI Bill. Boomers had the golden age of capitalism. Gen X had deregulation and trickle-down economics. And millennials? We've got venture capital, but we've also got the 2008 financial crisis, the decline of the middle class and the rise of the 1%, and the steady decay of unions and stable full-time employment. Now, as I said, there are some legitimate criticisms there, but there are also some flaws too. One of them being the student loan debt. On one hand, they want to attribute student loan debt to being something that's outside of our control, but then it's also my generation who's saying, let's replace student loans with free education. And free education is really just the exact same thing with a different name. You're saying, don't take money out of this pocket and call it tuition. Instead, take money out of this other pocket and call it taxes. Same shit, different name. And on that, I also have some troubles with just their rationale for how much of the millennial struggle is really outside of our control. Within the article, they say, even the trends millennials have popularized, like athleisure, speak to our self-optimization. Yoga pants might look sloppy to your mom, but they're efficient. You can transition seamlessly from an exercise class to a Skype meeting to child pickup. We use FreshDirect and Amazon because the time they save us allows us to do more work. Now, maybe it's just me, but most people I know who are wearing athleisure or yoga pants are doing so because they like the look. They like the style. It's comfortable. They're not doing it because they're constantly transitioning between athletics and work throughout the day. I'm just not buying that excuse. And likewise with the FreshDirect and Amazon rationale, I don't think people are using these services because they just don't have that much time and they need every free minute they have to do more work. I think they're just lazy. They'd rather just get something delivered to them rather than going out and doing it themselves. Now, I'm not saying this is inherently a problem. If that's how you want to use your time and your money, go ahead, but I don't think most millennials are doing this because they need more time to work. I just don't think that's telling the whole story. Now, while we're on the topic of, saving money and buying certain clothes because you just don't have the time, you can't really skip over this one part of the article that you can't blame on any other generation. You can't blame on anybody other than this person themselves. They say, Tim and I are not alone in this paralysis. My partner was so stymied by this multi-step, incredibly and purposefully confusing process of submitting insurance reimbursement forms for every single week of therapy that for months he just didn't send them and ate over $1,000. I don't care who you are. You can't blame that on baby boomers. You can't blame that on Gen X. That is 100% your own laziness. People want to talk about avocado toast being the reason why we're broke. Maybe it's you being so lazy to send in insurance papers that you're adding another $1,000 to your expenses. I think one of the core issues here is that for whatever reason, money and finances, people just tend to treat a little differently. Like if you're working out at the gym, and let's say you've been going to the gym for a couple months, and then somebody who's like way more experienced than you are, like The Rock, comes up to you and says, hey, I used to do what you're doing, but then I changed things a little bit. I started doing this, this, and this, and now look at me. People in general tend to be pretty open to that type of advice, especially when it's coming from somebody who, has done it. They've made that journey. They can tend to accept that. They tend to swallow that pill pretty easily. But whenever it comes to finances and money, people don't want to seem to accept that some sacrifices have to be made. If somebody has gotten themselves out of a financial hole and they say, hey, look, you're not spending your money well. You need to submit these papers on time so you don't add another $1,000 to your expenses. You're spending money on Amazon Fresh. You shouldn't be. Just wake up 30 minutes earlier in the morning and go to the grocery store yourself instead of paying the delivery fees and the service fees. Once people start giving that sort of financial advice, people get weird and they tend to not trust the advice of experts. They tend to just default to, oh, well, you don't know my experience, you don't know my life. These are just small things. They're not going to make or break me. When the people who have already made that journey probably know that those small things add up and it takes sacrifices to get yourself into a better financial situation. But for whatever reason, when it comes to money, we tend to stop listening. Now, one thing that really irritates me, and it's not just millennials, but it's people in general, is whenever they acknowledge and, are willing to address a flaw within themselves, but rather than resolve that and fix that, they instead just spend all their time focusing on what caused that and how that cause was from somewhere else. In the article, the author says, why can't I get this mundane stuff done? Because I'm burned out. Why am I burned out? Because I've internalized the idea that I should be working all the time. Why have I internalized that idea? Because everything and everyone in my life has reinforced it, explicitly and implicitly, since I was young. Life has always been hard, but many millennials are unequipped to deal with the particular ways in which it's become hard for us. Now, if you know that you think you should be working all the time because of 2 hyperlinked articles within your own article, why are you letting that control you? If you know that's where it came from, why are you continuing to let that control you? Why not accept, hey, this is not how things should be, this is not what I should be doing, and move on accordingly? Now, I get when it comes to your job and making ends meet, you might not always have that luxury. You might actually have to work all the time, but this isn't the only time this is brought up within the article. Later on, she says, one thing that makes that realization sting even more is watching others live their seemingly cool, passionate, worthwhile lives online. We all know what we see on Facebook or Instagram isn't real, but that doesn't mean we don't judge ourselves against it. I find that millennials are far less jealous of objects or belongings on social media than the holistic experiences represented there, the sort of thing that prompts people to comment, I want your life. So you know that what you're seeing on Facebook and Instagram isn't real. You know it's just the best highlights of their life, even if it's not really their life, but you're still letting it get to you. You know it's false. You've written that it's false, and you're still letting it influence you. Why? Now, there's one bit here that all millennials are currently struggling with to some degree that I think should give us all a really hard life lesson, and I'm hoping the author really learns it themselves considering the way they're writing about this. When we talk about millennial student debt, we're not just talking about the payments that keep millennials from participating in American institutions like home ownership or purchasing diamonds. It's also about the psychological toll of realizing that something you'd been told and came to believe yourself would be worth it. Worth the loans, worth the labor, worth all that self-optimization isn't. Now, once again, you can be frustrated and annoyed with the fact that everybody was telling you to go to college. Our previous generation was telling us we need to go to college, we need to get degrees to get good jobs, and that it didn't turn out that way. But it's also a worthwhile life lesson to be skeptical so that you know not to make the same mistake in the future. Because I know a number of people who were in college who were saying, well, this bachelor degree isn't worth that much, I guess I'll go get my master's. When this should give you the life lesson that maybe you shouldn't go get your master's just because everybody's telling you to. Maybe instead you should pursue other forms of education. Go online and find alternative sources to learn new skills that might actually give you a better return on your investment. It takes courage, it takes risks to kind of be the person who isn't going to follow the herd and isn't going to do things the way everybody else is going to do it. Now, as much fun as it is to talk shit about millennials, I will be honest and say that I think a lot of this is kind of a product of our education system. We spend so much of our lives in this weird bubble where everything is structured for us, everything is scheduled, and it doesn't really give us the freedom to kind of learn how to do that ourselves. Every day you go to school, and from 8 to 9 you're in this room, from 9 to 10 you're in that room, and so on. And then you also know pretty much from day one, you're going to have a test on this day, you're going to have a test on that day, and your final exam is on this day. But once you get out into the real world, and especially if you're going to pursue some of your own projects, if you're not just focused entirely on work, but if you have your own passion projects, you'll realize pretty quickly that you're not always going to have that structure, and it's going to take a lot of discipline. And I've experienced this myself because last year I wrote my first book. This is a 500-page book that I wrote myself, and I didn't have a boss. I didn't have a deadline. I didn't have an income at the time, yet I had to figure it out. I didn't have anybody to say, okay, chapter 1 is due on this day, chapter 2 is due on that day, here's a template, here's a structure to follow. All of that was determined by me, and as a result of that, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And the worst part about it all was that my failure would have actually kind of been a better situation. Because I was unemployed and I wasn't making any money, my failure was actually a pay raise. It was getting a job where I'd actually be making a much better living. So the amount of discipline it took to get that done was insane, and it's something we just don't learn in school. And I think that structure, as nice as it is sometimes, and it can be helpful, at times it's also the worst thing that can ever happen to you, because once you get that freedom, you're kind of lost, and you're in this state where you can't do the simplest things like submitting your voter registration form to the post office. Now, in case you think I'm being unfair to millennials, I'll cover this one last section of the article that addresses one of my least favorite terms ever created. The modern millennial, for the most part, views adulthood as a series of actions, as opposed to a state of being, an article in Elite Daily explains. Adulting, therefore, becomes a verb. To adult is to complete your to-do list, but everything goes on the list, and the list never ends. Somehow, millennials have discovered this endless to-do list that most people refer to as life. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like on the video, and if you want to stay up to date on my future videos, just subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think. Do you think I was too hard on millennials? Do you think millennials are a bit too self-centered and we think too many problems are just affecting our generation? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching.